Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. We're on the cusp of the holidays here on the pod, recording this one on the last day of November. I work hard on these podcasts all year long, goddammit. And so today I bestow on myself a gift. First of the season. I think you'll enjoy it as much as I'm going to. A conversation with one of my favorite panels, the Chiefs. 3 former Chiefs of Staff to Canada's most accomplished heads of government. They're making their 4th appearance here on the Herle Burly. They are Brian Topp, former Chief of Staff to Rachel Notley in Alberta, Deputy Chief to Roy Romanow in Saskatchewan, one of the architects of Jack Layton's Orange Wave federally. Today, he's a founding partner at GT&co. Tim Murphy, former Chief of Staff to Paul Martin, now CEO and Managing Partner of McMillan LLP. Ian Brodie, first Chief of Staff to Stephen Harper, central to the founding of the CPC, now Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Remember, we struck this panel to talk about the issues from the perspective of people who think about them not solely as campaigners do, but also as people that have to run a government do. So today I want to talk about how major policy choices, like what was contained in the fall economic statement, how they're affecting the political positioning of each of the parties as they head into year 3 of this mandate. Tim, Ian, Brian, thanks for making the time today. Our internal polling metrics tell us that you fellows are way up at the top of our pod popularity, so we should get a little goose in the ratings today. Thanks for coming on.
That's all Brian. That's all Brian.
A lot of it's Brian. A lot of it's Brian. Hey, you guys, I in addition to what I just said in the intro that we want to talk about, there was some very big news yesterday out of the United States about the government of India being involved in plots in the US, Canada, and elsewhere in the world to kill Sikhs that the Indian government considers dangerous. Trudeau was badly derided for amateur foreign policy when he revealed his belief that the Indian government was involved in the killing in Surrey. Yesterday seems like a vindication. What do you make of this situation, and how does Canada move forward, given that its recently announced foreign policy had India as a linchpin of that foreign? It was called the Indo-Pacific Strategy. So where is this all going? Brian, do you want to start?
Well, I think we have a fact that tends to validate what the Prime Minister chose to say in public, which was a pretty eye-popping thing to say in public, I have to say. And so we then, look, if we were still in our old jobs, we would say the matter's before the police, and the matter will then be before the courts. That's fundamentally where the matter stands, where the matter belongs. If an individual, and incidentally, perhaps an agent of a foreign power, has committed a murder on Canadian soil, then the matter is for the police, the intelligence services to make the case, and then that person needs to be in front of a court. And if it is proved that that's what they did, then they need to be in a prison. And so it's fundamentally, we're into a criminal matter here. And then with regard to the government of India, I think, frankly, the government of Canada did the right thing by putting the facts as it knew them before the government of India and asking them to help investigate it. And how the government of India responds to that, to some extent, will condition the relationship you can have with them. So far, what we have is, in effect, a flat denial and an invitation to present the facts, which hopefully the government of India will become aware of as the judge becomes aware of it. And it would seem that there's going to be concurrent proceedings in the United States. So that gives these prosecutors and intelligence services and police services the opportunity to cooperate, and then hopefully we'll get to the bottom of the matter more quickly.
Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brian. And by the way, I don't think you heard any accusation from me about amateurism on the Prime Minister's part. I thought, given what it seems he knew and what had gone on leading up to that announcement, that a public announcement was well in order. And given that the House of Commons was starting its fall sitting, I thought making that announcement on the floor of the House of Commons was a good decision. I think we learned from trying to get the 2 Michaels back from China that when you're dealing with similar sort of situation where you talk about the security of people, in the case of the 2 Michaels, Canadian citizens held abroad, and in this case here, security of Canadians, on Canadian soil. It helps to have allies. It's important to have allies, that the case becomes stronger when the Americans are on side. And then ultimately, a resolution where it's just Canada versus India or Canada versus China is, going to be a long time coming if it comes at all. if we have arrived at a situation where the Americans are on the same page we are, in fact, maybe a step ahead of us now since they're pursuing criminal charges, and Brian's right, this is presumably before the police in Canada, but we haven't seen criminal charges yet. It helps to have the Americans on side. I think if it turns out there's other countries pursuing similar sorts of cases against agents of India, that's all to the better. This is the thing this is an issue, sort of ground rules of the Indo-Pacific relationship for Canada that we should sort out now rather than later. If it's true that the Indian government and Indian agents are behind this, I don't think that's a barrier to having a bigger, more complicated relationship, but it's something we should sort out right away. And in some cases in the past, I think in the growth phase of our relationship with China, we were reluctant to put those cases on the ground for fear that it would impede our access to China. I think that was a mistake. And if we are really on the same page as the Americans here, I think that puts Canada and the United States in a strong position here. We should sort that out right away.
Tim?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any question that having the U.S. have similar issues, similar concerns raised is very helpful for us from a realpolitik perspective. At the end of the day, if this was an isolated circumstance and, in the global political world where we've got a surrogate war between Iran, Russia, and America running through the Mideast, we've got kind of, obviously most recent attempt by Biden to kind of cool temperatures with China. But let's be clear, there is I would hesitate to say Cold War, but it's heading in that kind of direction. With China, India was a linchpin of saying maybe we've got another significant economic power, 1.3 billion people, and this makes it very difficult. In Canada,
democracy, all that stuff. Yeah.
Right. And Canada isolated in that context in the realpolitik that the U.S. is dealing with was not good from our positioning. And so the fact that the U.S. appears to be in a similar position gives Canada, the cover of saying, we are participating in a process that has us facing India, but with the support of a significantly powerful ally just south of the border. So I think from a realpolitik perspective, it is, it's sadly helpful, I guess is the way I'd put it. I think the other lesson I hope we learn, there is a segment of the commentariat of the social media crowd of, news now over accuracy now crowd that immediately goes to, if I don't hear every fact in the first utterance of a government official, then they're hiding something that's wrong. And we've seen that in a series of events, and including this one. And, what I hope is over time, we are at least in areas where national security is at play, global interests at play, that it inevitably means that, public officials, prime ministers, and others are constrained in what they can say. And we ought to actually give them some degree of benefit of the doubt in that context. Now, maybe I'm asking too much and live in a Pollyannish world, but I do think this is a thing you can point to and say, hey, hang on and wait. This is, what the prime minister did was justified in the context, and facts he couldn't share appear to bear that out.
This is where just to pick up on something that Ian said, which is, we shouldn't stop us from having a broader, complex relationship with them. Does that mean, Brian, that you think that this shouldn't affect how the two countries interact, that this should be left to the courts and to the legal system, and government carries on with India as though this is not going on?
I was just going to say, sorry for trying to interrupt there, but just further to what Tim said, further to what he was saying, this is a very strong case for a functioning all-party intelligence committee, where everybody signs on the dotted line, right, that they're going to behave appropriately with the information that they hear. And then more parliamentarians than just the government are in the know about issues like this, and our public figures can debate them appropriately. But to your question, it's tricky. I think it's a very significant relationship with a lot of Canadian stakeholders, with significant population in Canada with roots in that country. It is the Asia Pacific is the economic future for any trading country for sure, and so you can't let incidents wreck your your economic strategy, but nor can you ignore the possibility of state-sponsored murder on your territory. And so the trick is to conduct a delicate diplomatic balancing act in which you speak clearly and directly and appropriately to a counterparty if it has in fact conducted itself like that, but not one where you are so over the top on it that you wreck the broader relationship. And that's a very tricky balancing act, but state-sponsored murder is a big thing. It's a big thing. But let's just be clear, as my colleagues have said, we don't necessarily have all the facts here yet either. So let's see where they go. But what we shouldn't do is nothing. You can't ignore something like this that has happened, and you need to not overreact to it either. And so it's a very tricky balancing act. And I think, as we've all said, in a way, I think the Prime Minister played his cards as well as he could, diplomatically, and it's over to the intelligence services and the police to do the rest of the job.
Yeah, you can't shut the door on India and population economic activity it represents in this global world. But look, if you compare it to China, where we've had some very serious issues, I think there's some important differences in how we've dealt with those two relationships and can deal with them even in this context, which is you can't drop the issue. You have to aggressively pursue it. It has to be front and center in the relationship. But that doesn't mean you stop all relationships, I don't think. And we did that in China. But there's two things that are distinctive, one of which is, in China, the thing that I think is significant is the degree of state-owned enterprises and the degree to which the economy is actually a lever of the state in China. Not true in India in that any of that same way. So Indian companies that want to invest here, that want to set up shop here, that we want to trade with, do not come with the imprimatur of a state vehicle in quite the same way as China does. And so there is room to have a nuance about the participation. That being said, I agree with Brian, that is a serious issue of serious concerns, and you need to have that dealt with and a process for dealing with it, while not totally cutting off the rest of the relationship with a growing economy.
Ian, anything to add to that before we move on?
No, I didn't mean to suggest, I don't think you meant to suggest, I suggested that we shouldn't do anything about this. This is a serious issue in the bilateral relationship. It's now a serious issue for not just our bilateral relationship, but with India's relationship with other democracies, including the United States. I think that puts us in a stronger position here. I do think that when, before the two Michaels, there were lots of instances of China not respecting Canada's consular rights regarding other citizens, not respecting international obligations regarding some of our companies, and we kind of let a lot of those go, hoping that in the fear that pursuing that would hold us back from the broader commercial relationship. And I think that was a mistake. I thought most of that was a mistake at the time. I think now clearly a mistake, and something we should not do again as we begin to engage more seriously with China and other countries in the Indo-Pacific.
Right. Cool. So I'm picking up where I left off last week, because the story was only half told, Herle Burly-ites. And damn it, I'm a completionist, especially when our presenting sponsor Telus asks me rather politely to be a completionist. If you recall, I was talking about a new PwC report released in October that highlighted Canadians' ever-growing appetite for digital data. Not only that, but the rather large role the telecommunications sector plays in our national economy. Pretty sure I used the descriptor humongous to describe that. Well, the PricewaterhouseCoopers report also shone a light on network resiliency and the impacts on it, specific to Canada. The short story is this. The climate here is generally considered to be warming twice as fast as global averages. Wildfires and atmospheric rivers have become all too familiar additions to our national lexicon. What the PwC report makes clear is the massive amount of investment that's required to harden network infrastructure, due mainly to our severe weather and natural disasters related to climate change. For Telus, that number is more than $110 million invested in the last 6 years alone. Think expanded generator capacity, solar-powered cell towers, lifting buildings and offices in flood-prone areas, proactive brush clearing to prevent fire damage. And whereas I find redundancy annoying and generally something to be avoided in life, in telecommunications, what you want is more and more of it. Telus is continually upgrading network infrastructure to add critical backup systems with less potential for downtime. More redundancy and more capacity, so data never stops moving. PwC's report lays it out there, Herle Burly-ites. Canadians' expectations for more data, speed, and reliability never abates. That's only possible with ongoing investment, as well as support from government and a regulatory environment that continues to make those investments make fiscal sense. Okay, let's soar up into the air 30,000 feet and tackle this question. The government, the last election was October 2021. So that places us precisely at the halfway mark of a 4-year term right now, assuming that it were to be a 4-year term. What phase is that in a government? What mode is the center in at this stage of a government? Ian?
Well, it's a minority government, and so in a sense, the day-to-day urgency of the political affairs of the government are more important than they would be if this was the midway point of a majority, I think. But the timing is nonetheless.
It's a hybrid, though, isn't it?
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I want to. If I were the Prime Minister, I want to trust my parliamentary allies, but verify every day.
Yeah.
It's nice to have an agreement with the NDP, but it's not. There's no court of arbitration in the case that it falls apart at the midway. That said, I don't think it's anybody's interest at the moment to blow up that arrangement. I can't see there a pressing reason for anybody to want to blow it up. But to get back to your question, I mean, 2 years, I think, is now the right time to think about starting to flesh out that re-election campaign. You've got a couple of budgets, maybe, and a couple of fall economic statements. You've got really one main legislative session of Parliament left before the election. I know it sounds like a lot of time, but it's not really. If the government has a substantial piece of legislation, it's going to be complicated to get through the House of Commons, and in a minority, even with the deal with the NDP, it's complicated. You want to see that introduced in January, February, March. If you're leaving it much later than March, you're putting at risk of not, maybe you don't want it passed before the next election. But if you want something passed before the next election, it's kind of got to be in the drafting hopper now. You want to have had some drafting instructions to the DOJ. Maybe you get another pass through cabinet in February before you introduce it in March or April. But, you've been through this. That's not a lot of time. And particularly if you want to give some people some time off after Christmas. So this is the time when I think we're starting to see, re-election campaign of the Prime Minister's come together. If he's going to give some thought to whether he wants to, run again, he's running out of time to make that decision and to leave the Liberal Party with enough time to pick somebody to replace him and to put together a re-election campaign of its own. Members of John Turner, your friend John Turner, left without enough time to put together an election campaign. Really, this is, I think, the serious fall of where we didn't expect to see a lot of big announcements for the re-election campaign, but hopefully some behind-the-scenes thinking and some markers put down in the economic statement to give some room for a re-election campaign that really does begin when Parliament comes back, maybe not right at the end of January, but certainly by Valentine's Day, we'll be into the beginning of the re-election campaign. And at that point, the Prime Minister has to answer for himself, do I want to do this again? Do I see enough things left on my personal to-do agenda to want to invest in really kind of a 6-year commitment here, right? 2 years to the election, then 3 or 4 years past the election, let's say. Does he have a 5-year run in him? Does he have enough energy for that? I'm not sure we saw that over the fall, but starting to see sparks of it, or we saw that over the summer, but starting to see sparks of that in the fall. And I think that's a good sign for politics at a time when we maybe had a bit of a sleepwalk over the course of the past year.
Tim, if I was an asshole, I would point out that you never got to the second year of a mandate, but that might reflect more on me than you. So I won't do that.
Sorry, who does that reflect on? Who does that reflect on?
Me, I think.
Something to do with that.
Yeah, me, I think. But theoretically,
Well, we were in the second year. We never got to the third year.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. What do you think they ought to be doing there right now? Are they in, as Ian said, very strategic political re-election mode, or are they still in, we've got a couple of years governing mode?
Well, what they're in and what they should be in may not be the same. I mean, it's like, this is the time in which you go, do we have the right team? Do we have the right themes? Do we have the right ideas? Do we know kind of where we're heading? Are we putting the pieces together that we can build towards? And, I agree. We've got actually only 2 budgets and 1 FES in a fall economic statement in advance of the next election as the major economic set piece, communication tools. What's the plan for how those 3 roll out? What do we build on? And that's, what you should be sitting down and assessing in the context, by the way, of, frankly, someone like you, David, would have done a significant kind of baseline survey of public opinion, delving into what are the strengths, weaknesses, what are they caring about, like not from a partisan perspective, but really what's motivating, you know better than I, right? What's motivating people, what are they thinking about, or what will change minds? And then starting to lay the groundwork for that in terms of, we're seeing a bit of that. They've appointed the Liberals appointed a campaign chair, director, manager, whatever the title is. And so we're seeing some of that preparation start to occurring. I think the biggest challenge they have is, do they have the right horses for courses? We've got, what's clear is, we've got an, affordability, like it's interesting. I saw people who have large mortgages that are coming up for renewal, the support for the government is incredibly bad, right? Obviously, if you're a renter, it's not
negative integers.
Yeah. Suddenly you're sitting there. If you take out people with mortgages and renters, there's not many voters left. And so, there's some serious issues to be addressed. And it's not just in the second year of a mandate. It's actually after serving since 2015. And so you have to, you're doing that in the context of a team that's been around a long time, have been together. You've kind of used up a ton of ideas. You come to the table with perceptions of you already significantly set, as well as, ideas that that you've poo-pooed before. It's tough to kind of relaunch. Now, one person, sorry to monologue here, but one person I think who's done that a bit is Fraser in the housing portfolio, right? He's found a way to kind of at least look like the government's doing something around the issue, and obviously it's not going to solve affordability for housing.
It's so interesting, Tim, that he could do that because he didn't have a single new policy tool that didn't exist for the previous minister.
Yeah.
Right. It's just political skill.
Correct. And that's my horses for courses coming, right? Because it's clear the government's got a challenge. It's got an electorate that goes, I can't afford my house. I can't afford my when I'm renting. I can't afford my food. Gas or heating is too, who's speaking to me? And that's a challenge the government has not solved yet.
Brian? 2 years in, you've been there several times.
True. Well, the first thing to say about 2 years in, my colleagues basically alluded to this, is this is where everybody decides whether they're going to stay or not. And so from the Prime Minister on down to the most junior MA, everybody has to look at their cards and go, honorably, I'm either going to leave now or I'm staying to the election. And everybody has their decisions to make about that. And they're all kind of interesting, aren't they? But you're going to need to put together the people who are still there 6 months from now. That's the election team.
And if they're not running again, would you drop them from the cabinet, Brian?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's been a federal pattern is that everybody gets asked, are you running or not? And if you're not running, then you can expect to be shuffled out.
Yeah.
So that, look, this is about the time where you take stock of how you've done with the election commitments that you made, and then you turn your mind to what's on the public's mind that will still be on their mind when it is time to vote. Now, in this parliament, certainly when the Conservatives are as high as they are at the moment, the government can go to the end of its term if it wants to, but it's not free. Government can choose to do that, but that will come at a price. It's going to have to find a partner in the House that's willing to support it. and I believe that's available, but not for free. So that's a threshold question for the government. Does it actually want to force an election now? I don't think so. And if not, then it is going to have to settle its parliamentary affairs. So then it needs to ask itself, what does the public care about, and what are we doing about it? Because they're running, as we've just discussed, they're running out of room to do anything about it. And I think it's pretty fair to say, and I think Tim put this very well, that in the first thing that people are worried about is mortgage holders with mortgage renewals are facing really big increases. And so the effect of interest rates on middle class voters in target Liberal ridings is really important. And the broader cost of living is important to working people and ridings all across the country. And by the way, the public still cares a lot about healthcare. And so that's what they want to hear governments talking about. And the government basically in the fall economic statement, in a way, but not in any way that I think the public could see, was trying to do something about the interest rate issue. And so essentially it was talking to the Bank of Canada. We were talking about this before we came on, and it was talking to investors, and it was saying the government is going to moderate its hyper-aggressive fiscal policy, and that's going to give the banks some room to drop interest rates. And then they're going like this and hoping that it works. And that will begin to mitigate the first problem they've got. They have nothing to say about the second issue, a broader cost of living issue, and they have nothing to say about healthcare that anybody can hear right now. And on this, we'll see whether this government's got any jam left. I mean, and sometimes governments just run out of gas. There's been a fair bit of talk about after about 10 years, every team is just out of gas, and then you either have to do something pretty big to renew yourself, or you're probably going to be removed. But they still have a window. They have one window, and they need to make it good. And just managing things and bumbling along and not doing much and hoping that things improve is not going to do the job, because the official opposition, to their credit, has their finger right on the issue that most voters care about. And although what they're proposing is ridiculous, their criticism is very.
They've diagnosed the problem.
Right.
Right. So we're getting into the time of year for looking back. News organizations love looking back. Readers and viewers like reminiscing, which is why you'll see listicles about the best movies of 2023, the best books, the biggest news stories, year-end quizzes, etc., etc. If you've had an annus horribilis, it isn't terribly pleasant looking back. Happily, 2023 has been the opposite for our sponsor, CN. The railway has improved just about every metric that matters and continues to do so. Speed, for example, or more precisely, velocity. Speed is how fast something goes. Velocity, to a railway, is how far a train travels in a single day. Let me unpack that. Trains often face delays getting out of the station, delays during a journey while they sit on a siding waiting for another train to pass in the opposite direction, delays loading or unloading, or delays while a railway copes with the landslide or a fire or a blizzard, and how quickly engineers get traffic moving again. To put it simply, CN's velocity improved last year. As a matter of fact, in the past couple of years, CN's velocity has improved by about 20%. That's a big deal. It means CN trains are traveling more smoothly, more efficiently. Something else that's changed for the better? CN's departure rate. Again, more simply put, that means CN trains are more punctual. Right now, 90% of CN's trains depart and arrive on time. That's as compared to 79% last year, which is good, very good indeed. Other metrics relating to profitability and staffing levels have changed for the better too, but really it all comes down to leaving and arriving on time. That and a relentless commitment to safety. The Globe and Mail's report on business credits these improvements in part to Tracy Robinson, who took over as CN CEO in early 2022. The newspaper named her Business Newcomer of the Year for 2023, noting that investors and customers are happier. All of which makes this past year an annus mirabilis for Canada's iconic railroad. Okay, I had to look that up, but it's sure nice to have one. Okay, so that's a great lead in, Brian, to the fall economic statement that Minister Freeland delivered last week. I'll give you my 2-second take on it, Tim, and then you can react. So debt and deficit are up and projected to go up a little bit more and then down a lot, as projections often say.
Safely after the next election, David.
Yeah. Little boutique items that didn't seem terribly consequential to me. A mortgage charter that seemed more like comms than policy to me. So the major things I took from it, and I did see a strategy emerging, and I don't know whether they intended or not, but here's what I saw. First of all, I saw what Brian just said, which is we can't possibly win unless the economy is much better and unless people feel much better about it. So that is job one. Let's get out of the way of Tiff Macklem. Let's get him get inflation where he wants to get it to, and then start lowering rates. And hopefully in 2024, people are feeling some updraft in the economy. Point number one. Point number two is they're not increasing the deficit anymore, but they're not lowering it either. And they're going to stand and fight here, and they're going to characterize this as responsible. And they're going to characterize Singh and Poilievre as irresponsible for different reasons on the fisc. And they're going to try to triangulate on their fiscal position, and of course, ultimately run against the Conservatives on a hidden agenda of cuts to spending. That's where this all lands up. So anyway, that's just me, Tim. Is that what you saw, and what do you think about that?
So I think I do think that's what kind of I read between the tea leaves they're trying to set up, and or at least maintain the opportunity to make that case. I do, but it's sort of I guess at the end of the day, that was just all framing, and I guess to be fair, a fall economic statement shouldn't expect much from. Although there was like $20 billion in more spending in it announced since the last budget. So, but you know better than I. I mean, Canadians really don't care about deficit and debt that much anymore. Probably haven't for like 30 years. But except to the extent which it becomes a surrogate for competence, right? And I think they're okay around that issue, or at least setting up an argument that they're okay around how they've managed the fisc as around a competence issue, and in the context that you've articulated about framing themselves against the two opposition parties in an election to come for different reasons. But when I look at that, I still it feels like what they're saying is in another year, right? Because the announcements even for spending there generally don't kick in until 2025 anyway, is what they seem to be is building a strategy that's saying we're going to have to go through a valley of the shadow of death for another year and hope that we climb out the other side at the end of it in a timing that makes it work, for us. So to your point that the way we're at in the global economy and domestically allows interest rates cuts, that the economy, that the anxiety about the economy starts to improve. Because actually you can argue the economy is okay right now, frankly, when you look at issues like unemployment. I mean, yes, we've got broader, longer term
everything
issues,
but inflation and interest rates, and they trump everything.
Yeah, correct. Agreed. And so it's kind of a, let's hope those can get fixed in time for the next election, which, goes back to the point Brian made, which is, if I'm, that requires a deal that lasts through and into 2025. Because even if you have interest rates come down in the probably, summer, fall-ish of 2024, for that to roll into the economy, have an impact, change attitudes, that's another number of months, right? So the real question is, can they survive their stroll through the valley of death in terms of their deal with the NDP and allow those things to work? And that's obviously the strategy, that's the hope, and they better hope the NDP play along.
So Ian, they're 15 points down and maybe still falling, right? They're behind in every demographic group except women over the age of 55. They have almost zero economic credibility with people. Can they get elected on this course we're talking about, or do they need to do something really different?
Well, let me give you the risks, because we've had sort of a happy discussion about the fall economic statement, which is fine. I think you're right about the assessments that were built into it. And by the way, let me put the point on in case we just left it out there implied. If it's a 2-year plan for economic recovery, that means the Prime Minister's planning to be around for the next 2 years. This wasn't a fall economic statement of crossing off the last 5 things on his to-do list so he could leave in February. So if all the fantasies in Ottawa and in the press about him taking a walk in the woods or walk in the snow in February, it strikes me that if that's the plan, it wasn't reflected in the economic statement. Right. It's not just, of course, homeowners who have to refinance their mortgage in the coming months. the government of Canada has a substantial refinancing of its own debt coming up. It's a continual problem, but there's issues coming up in 2025. They're crossing their fingers and crossing their toes and hoping to hell that over the course of the next 12 months, there isn't a problem with that. And given the U.S. Treasury has been sort of skating around trying to refinance its debts over the course of the past couple of weeks, I'm not sure that that's a safe bet. So, yes, we're not in a situation where debt and deficit and economic management is at the top of the agenda in that kind of traditional 1990s fiscal sense. But that could be a very temporary situation. You and Tim, and God knows Brian, have been around the table when the finance minister or the treasurer goes to New York and finds out there's nobody who wants to lend you any money anymore. Quick decisions have to be made very quickly, and so this kind of stability fall economic statement is the subject of being disrupted. I think now the other bet they're making, this goes back to your question, the government is betting that in the absence of other spokesmen for the government, and despite Sean Fraser's had a politically adept start as housing minister, but other than the four of us, we could add some members of the Fraser family and half the Liberal caucus. The rest of the country have no idea who Sean Fraser is and haven't paid any attention. So that's half of his caucus colleagues probably have difficulty picking him out of a lineup.
Might be the tallest one in the lineup. That's
fair enough. Okay, the tall guy is the housing minister. Thanks. We're still assuming that the prime minister is a net positive spokesman for the government's agenda. Jason Kenney made that assumption over the course of 3 years that as his trustworthiness assessment and his assessment of his competence kind of collapsed in the Alberta opinion polls, the more and more he was out in public, it turned out that just made the situation worse and worse. I think now the government is at the hostage of external forces here. Something has to happen in the external world beyond the government's control to kind of restore the prime minister as a leader that people are going to listen to. The rest of these announcements, he can make all the announcements, but if people have decided to fundamentally tune him out, he can go out and talk and nobody's paying any attention. And it strikes me that for the time being, at least, something about his tone, something about his personality. Look, I won't surprise you to learn I was never a Trudeau voter to begin with. So sometimes I've had trying to puzzle through what it was that people found about him in the first place. But whatever it is, it's not punching through right now. And the more he's in public, I don't think it's making things any better. I think there'd have to be something to the external environment that changes here to put him back to the front. So then can you bring down the cost of living? Can you bring down the cost of refinancing more? Just hope that the Government of Canada bond issues don't fail over the course of the next couple of years. Yeah, buckle up, because this really is the valley of the shadow of death for the next year. The Liberals hope it's just a year.
Mm. Brian, would you be riding stay the course, or would you be advocating, holy fuck, we really need to shape our profile here?
Well, look, just begin by talking about the leadership thing. It's true that often, leaders just get past their best before date and then they're done. And then what you have to calculate, is there anybody better around here, or would it be better for the tribe for me to eat the inevitable defeat so that my successor doesn't have to wear it? So there's that calculation. But there's another piece to the puzzle, okay, which is if we look at recent Canadian history, I think, for example, a little painfully, of the 2013 BC election, first ministers who look like they're dead sometimes aren't. And so, and anything can happen in an election campaign. And I can tell you from bitter experience that Liberal leaders in general are not to be underestimated. And so, I'm not sure that he'll be dead when he's dead, and he's not dead yet. But I think he's in big trouble. There's no doubt about that. Now, there are two possibilities here. Either the government is snake bit and cannot be saved, or they're having midterm blues, which are pretty typical in the middle of a second term, and they need to do something about it. So they need to do something about it for sure. I don't think they can just stand pat and do nothing. I think as I said, the official opposition is being too effective in speaking to what people care about for that strategy to be possible. You could make an argument that the way they played their cards this fall could ultimately help them by dealing with this interest rate thing with the footnote. But ultimately, they're going to have to talk in terms that cut through, that are clear and understandable and meaningful about what people care about. And I wouldn't be a good New Democrat without saying, in addition to worrying that I can't afford my house and I can't afford my groceries, people in the land are worried, and I don't have a doctor. Okay, and those are the sets of issues that people are concerned about. And I think if the government was wise, it would have important things to say about all of them, in part because their conservative opponents can't talk importantly about all of them. So I think they're going to have to do something smart, right? And the question is whether they can do that, or whether at the end of the day they're just out of gas and out of ideas, and they're just waiting for this to be over. And we've all seen this, where you end up in an organization where your fundamental election slogan is "Let's get this over with," and maybe that's what they're going to do, But I think it's always worth trying. You never know what might happen.
So, David, if I can jump in, I think if I'm sitting in, the Prime Minister's office and the campaign team, I think the one, despite what the polling shows right now, the one thing that, one of the things that would give me hope is actually the opposition leader. Despite I think, an investment in his profile by the Conservative Party and improvement in those numbers, I would think, sitting in their shoes, it still feels superficial, and that there are flashes of the behavior of that leader that still come through in environments where, his likability does not feel very strong. And if I'm the Prime Minister campaigning against him and I find the right issues, there's still veins to be pursued that will give me an advantage when the electorate really focuses. And I think you would know, in the US, there's, you see Trump versus Biden things where Trump is suggesting that he will win, and there's this view that maybe now what people respond to polls are saying is they use as an opportunity not to tell you how they vote, but to express dissatisfaction with the government and get them to do something different. And so there might be some hope.
What Democrats say.
I accept that there's, the wish may be parent to the thought there, but I also the thing that scares me, and David, I hate to bring this up, but you and I did this, right? Like, are we heading into the Ontario 2018 provincial election, right, where Kathleen Wynne was the premier, had at that point we had hydro prices and a few other things, and frankly, I think you ran a great campaign. She probably won the debate, and it just didn't matter because the electorate
nobody was listening to us anymore. We could convince people not to vote Conservative, and we could convince people not to vote NDP, but we could not convince people to vote Liberal.
Yeah,
right.
And so that scares the hell out of me. That if we get, and that, do I feel like the federal Liberals are in that position yet? No. But I do worry that if we spend the year in this valley of death, like hoping for the things to turn, that we may get to that point, and it doesn't matter if it turns because they'll just stop listening. And I think that risk is already there. And so that leads me to say, okay, so what if that's the risk of a year of hoping that it turns, and understanding, to be fair to them, right, that the things they're hoping turn, they can't actually do that much about, right? Interest rates, inflation, it's a global phenomenon. They can fool around the edges. So that leads me to say, are there things I can do and say now that make voters think a bit differently about me?
Well, let me put an idea to you.
Okay.
Let me put a proposition to you. If I was their pollster, I would be briefing the cabinet, and I would be saying, we should kill this consumer carbon tax. It is killing us. It is killing us. It is not essential to our climate change plan, and it is politically killing us, and we should reverse course. And people say that will be embarrassing, and it will be, but not as embarrassing as the election result is going to be. And so we should do it. And some people say if you did that, the slats would come right out from under the whole thing because you've eliminated a core part of your brand and then there's just nothing left. Do you think there's a way that could be executed elegantly?
Wow, that's a tough one, because I actually think, part of my concern there is the government's pinned so much on it. It's kind of one of the last slats in arguing it's a progressive government. I mean, and, look, we saw, I'll give you an analogy again, an uncomfortable one, but Kathleen Wynne, right, her move to privatize part of Hydro One kicked the progressive slats out from underneath her, and they never came back.
Right.
And my worry is that, and there we got a bunch of voters who were, ended up voting NDP in 2018, frankly, that we lost around that issue. And something like that could permanently, I think, give you the cost without the benefit. And that to me is the risk. I don't know, I'd like to see a lot more before I signed on to that. But sitting here, I worry, I agree, the cost is there, but I don't know if the benefit comes when you get rid of the cost.
But what won't work is what they did. And what they did was a piecemeal, unorganized, chaotic, crazy little nibble at it that raised the basic issues of competence. Let's be clear about this carbon pricing thing. Carbon pricing is a conservative program. It was brought in place by a conservative government in British Columbia on a quid pro quo of tax cuts. And it was supported by the population and helped them defeat the NDP, who opposed it in British Columbia. And then it was adopted by the government of Alberta under Rachel Notley as part of an implicit offer to conservatives, which is, if you stop denying that climate change is real, we'll adopt your program, which is carbon pricing. Okay, the idea that market mechanisms are going to address the issue. And then what conservatives have done since then, as it became national policy, was they adopted the BC NDP's original line on this and are running a tax populist campaign against their own policy that was supported by key conservative leaders in Alberta when it was thought through, after having been implemented by a conservative government in British Columbia. Very similar to how Republicans, when Obama said, okay, you're not going to go for public Medicare, so we'll adopt your plan, and we'll just make sure that private health insurance is available to everybody on the Romney plan that had been introduced in Massachusetts. And then the Republicans flip on their own policy and start running populist campaigns against it, even though they're running against themselves. So all this to say, if the deal, which is we're going to stop arguing that climate change is real, is not done, and conservatives are running against their own policies, which is that carbon pricing is the way to go because it's the most economically efficient way to address a real problem. And instead, they're just going straight populist on it. And I think it is reasonable for progressives to ask themselves, do we need to follow conservative policies if conservatives themselves still want to live in the world of climate change denial to get a little, one more election on populism? And there are alternatives to carbon pricing that people on the progressive side argue are more effective than asking people to pay nudge taxes at the price at the pump that they're then reimbursed for. And I think that's a legitimate debate. But it would be a big throw, right? It would be definitely a big throw. And the last thing I'll say about it is, at the end of the day, there is a model for this that's kind of interesting, and that Ian might agree is interesting. Somebody actually did what you're just talking about, and that was Jason Kenney. And Jason Kenney did exactly what you're talking about, which is he got rid of the consumer carbon price and the rebates, bearing in mind there was then a federal back bill, and kept industrial carbon pricing, which is the guts of the matter. And an awful lot of 40-year capital bets have been made on the idea that industrial carbon pricing is here to stay. Dismantling it would be grotesquely irresponsible. It would be strongly opposed by the investment community. No responsible person would propose it. On the consumer side here, this business of a nudge tax in return for a rebate, I think that's more debatable, given the conservatives didn't keep the deal.
Ian, it feels to me like Poilievre has convinced people that the carbon tax is a factor in their affordability challenge. And therefore, as long as it exists, the Liberals can't be part of the affordability solution because they're part of the problem.
Yeah, let me first of all just say, no conservative leader at the federal level or anywhere outside of Alberta has ever run on the carbon tax. If I recall, the two positions were Stéphane Dion's and Justin Trudeau's. So let's just be clear, at the federal level, there's no conservative plan for the carbon tax. It never has been. And it was an option floated when I was in government. Obviously, we took a a good look at it, went in a different direction. So the idea that there's somehow some conservative roots to the carbon tax, I just reject that outright. The pros and cons of the carbon tax, we can have a discussion about that, but the idea that it's some kind of conservative idea, I don't think there's any evidence for that. And the conservative governments here in Alberta that ran on
it doesn't come from the part. Let's be, if I just interject, my sense is it does not come from the partisan conservative world. It comes from the intellectual conservative world.
No, it comes from the intellectual liberal world.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. No, let me be clear about that. It comes from the intellectual liberal world. And that's why liberal governments have...
Mark Cameron would be surprised, and so would Ken Rosenthal.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ken and Mark have been at this internally inside the party for a very long time, and they have lost on every single occasion. They've lost on every single occasion. I mean, Ken and Mark are both friends of mine, but regrettably, I'm telling you what I've told them, they've lost on every single occasion.
Right.
But the problem with the carbon tax is that people, go back to Tim's comment. Do we have the right horses for courses? If the course is we have to do everything we can to reduce the cost of living problem in Canada, that includes dealing with cost of energy, carbon energy that's higher than it otherwise would be, except for all these carbon strategies with carbon tax, clean fuel tax, net zero electricity thing coming down the tube. The parliamentary budget office has been clear about this. This has huge costs on the Canadian economy for a net contribution to the global effort that is very difficult to measure. And we understand we're paying a very high price here for it, and the actual impact on global climate policy is very hard to measure. As you can see, by a very high carbon tax didn't stop forests from burning this past summer. So, you're paying up front, and the benefit is so small the parliamentary budget officer can't see it with very sophisticated economic models. If you say we're going to do everything we can to reduce the cost of living problem, you've got to do something about the carbon tax. And that means you've got a horses for courses problem, because there is no way that Justin Trudeau can run a re-election campaign or remain as prime minister for the next 2 years if you're repealing what has been the signature part. I mean, read Hansard of the last 8 years and all of the debates that have gone back and forth. If you had to do TV ads about this, David, you would spend 35 seconds going through footage of Hansard from CPAC to find the prime minister taunting about the carbon tax, to find successive environment ministers taunting about the carbon tax. And that's assuming the prime minister could keep his current environment minister, his current natural resources minister, based on a U-turn of that nature. I mean, you are really talking about, this is not course correction on some issue related to, housing, mortgage, finance, or something like that. You said that, the deficit issue doesn't register with the population. You know what also doesn't register with the population right now? Climate change is not an issue. Reconciliation with Indigenous people is not an issue. Equity and diversity issues is not an issue with the public. The problem here is the prime minister has built his entire brand around that. And to go back to Tim's horses for courses, if you think that's part of the problem, and his plan is to stick around for another 2 years, that's at the core of the government's problem. It doesn't matter whether you think the opposition leader is likable or not. Go do your polling and try and find out all the people who thought Stephen Harper was likable. Didn't stop him from having a 9-year run. Likability is not the critical issue here. The critical issue here is, what are you doing for people's personal day-to-day lives here? And if you think it comes to, we have to do everything on cost of living, the prime minister's the wrong horse for that course.
All right, Tim, let's move on. Let's move on to Poilievre, because Ian brought it up.
Okay.
Right. So, and let's, approach this from the perspective of you're in his office. He's riding really high right now. He's headed toward a big win, but it is 2 years away.
Yeah.
Theoretically, at least, pending our next conversation. But is there anything that he needs to watch out for or do differently than he is currently doing? Would you advise him to do anything differently, or is he just fucking on a course?
Well, every measure suggests what he's doing is working, so I'm not sure I'd be sitting in his office going change. And even, should he roll out policy? Well, I would argue why, one of the first rules of politics is, and the other side shooting themselves in the foot, don't get in the way, right? Don't create a distraction. I don't think he needs it. I think he's diagnosed the right problem. He's speaking consistently to that problem. And no matter what issue, he always comes back to it, and I think that's the right message, the right positioning. Does he need policy to back that up? No, the fact they've got the wrong policy, they're in charge, they're doing it wrong. There's an implied policy in it, and it's not going to be examined at this point in time. And why would you stick your head up above the parapet? From a behavioral point of view, look, sometimes I think he did a good, like those ads with his family were good. Like there was some attempt to soften the image. I think every once in a while, behaviorally, he hardens it a bit. And sometimes I think it's, to shore up his right side, to do fundraising. And sometimes I think it's just who he is. You might want to say you don't need that to continue to succeed where you're at. But I would say, but overall, keep doing what you're doing and let the government wallow in the low 20s.
Ian, do you have any different take on that? Do you have any words of advice about Poilievre?
If it is 2 years to the next election, then that's 2 years of being the opposition leader. And the job of the opposition leader is, I hate to be literalist about this, is to oppose. And he's very good at that. He's going to continue to oppose. I think we would be making a mistake to underestimate the positive impact of his tone, as much as all sorts of people might find, well, we need to soften this, we need to soften that. I'm not sure that quite is the match for politics it is in the mid 2020s. I don't think the kind of traditional expectations of he doesn't look prime ministerial or something like that. I think we need to reevaluate those. And then the question of who will be the best government for the future after the election is an issue for the election campaign. So I think rolling out substantial pieces of policy between now and the next election is pointless. His job is to oppose. There's more to be done on that. I think making the case that the government has lots of wasteful spending or lots of misplaced spending that needs to be brought under control, that we can bring it under control and you and your average day-to-day life won't notice it. I think there's some space to be occupied on that. I think the committee hearings into the Arrive Canada app is the beginning of a campaign on that, and there's 2 years to roll that out. But I don't think we're going to see big changes in the economic focus. Is the economic focus. Poilievre's team is, every day somebody phones in and says, why don't you do something else other than the economic focus? And the response from friends of ours who are there is the economic focus is what's going to win the election. He hasn't really started to move on the violent crime.
Do you think it's said that politely, Ian?
No. My ears are still ringing from the conversation. It's not that bad. But we have a family podcast, or at least your part's not. I'm trying my part to be a family podcast.
You're a professor. You have to have some modicum.
Exactly. Yes, I have to maintain my professorial nature. Yes. But as he hasn't moved to the violent crime piece yet, we haven't talked about violent crime, but that is not, the government is trying to undo the damage it did with its bail reform before it gets actuated. But Poilievre hasn't really weighed into that yet. And so he's got time for that too. I mean, he has optionality for the next 2 years, and the government's optionality is running out. And I like to be on the optionality side of the curve rather than the options running outside of the curve.
Brian, do you see any vulnerability in Poilievre that if you were there, you'd want to shore up?
Well, the first thing I'd remember if I was on Team Poilievre is that 2 years before the 1988 election, if I can go back to when we were all children, by far and away, the most popular leader and the person who's going to win the election was Ed Broadbent. And so, what looks great in the middle of a term isn't necessarily what's going to happen at the end. Let's start with that. So secondly, I believe it is true in politics, and I think we just demonstrated that in Manitoba, by the way, that neither straight positive nor straight negative is likely to win elections. Every once in a while it can, the straight negative thing that the public is really, really cranked. But for the most part, just going straight negative isn't gonna work. Because at the end of the day, you're running to be the leader of the official opposition, and you're gonna get what you ask for, usually. So I think if I was worrying about what is, to be clear, a very successful run right now by the Conservatives and by Mr. Poilievre, doing very well. As I say, he put his finger right on what people care about, and he's speaking in terms that speak well outside of their universe. What I would worry about is that the tone that this man speaks in suggests that he respects nothing. That he has no respect for anything, that anything that's in his way, he will vilify and that he will pound. And what that suggests is that nothing is safe in his hands. And that's not what Canadians are looking for from a prime minister. And so at a certain point, it's too hot. It's too much. It is too convoy. It is too angry prairie rural. It is too destructive. And there are things about our country that Canadians cherish and care about. And they want to know that they're safe in the hands of the government of Canada. And in this sense, I'll give him credit. That he took on Smith in Alberta on the CPP gave me a little bit of hope. Because that was the first time I've ever heard him say that something about our country is something that he thinks is good and should be protected. And I think they should ask themselves is, a little bit more of that, a little bit more of the idea that just straight negative won't elect you, and that that you need to get across that the country is going to be okay if you're the prime minister. Will make people in the country a little more comfortable with you. And the alternate, what the risks that he runs is at the end of the day, he'll get framed as a hothead and as somebody who just wants to burn things down. And I think on election day, that's not necessarily going to sell outside of his base.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting. Sorry, David.
Go ahead, Tim. Yeah, go ahead.
Just for me, it's tough for me from the outside to analyze because the Conservative Party is a different beast than, especially in its current incarnation, that I know or have experience with. But I just think, like Bill Clinton had his Sister Soldier moment, right? That notion of you take something on that surprises people about what they expect. And part of me says, to Brian's point, is there something like that Poilievre can do where people have an image of him in terms of his tone, his oppositional stance, his kind of, I brook no dissent, but takes a position in some public way on an issue. It doesn't need to do it now, but sometime within the time frame, within 6 months of an election, takes a surprising position that is more moderate. I don't even know what it is, but as a way of signaling to people on certain kinds of issues, I can be the positive. I can be the custodian of a national good, not just a national opposition. And I think about that. Now, maybe I'm just too out of where the Tories live and the votes they want to get, but I think something like that could really seal the deal for people who still have doubt about it.
The Conservatives in Manitoba, who are playing an okay game, honestly, like last winter. They came out with a relatively moderate budget, and they spent a lot of public money to talk it up. And they narrowed the gap between themselves and the Democrats in Manitoba, basically on what Tim just said, which is that they were kind of suggesting to the people of Manitoba that healthcare would be safe in their hands, that they would undo some of the damage that the public perceived that they had done to public health, public education, public services. And then for reasons that are really hard to understand, they threw all that out in August. And when they reemerged from a period of silence and uncorked their campaign, they ran a very hot campaign, if I may say so, a pure Poilievre-esque campaign against school children and murdered women. And we're running angry, blaring, billboards all over Winnipeg and on television. That it was all about trying to rile people, take a stand up, be strong, no more, all this kind of language that you see in Tory fundraising stuff that's good at raising money from Tories, but turned out not to be a good pitch to middle-class voters in middle-class ridings in the south part of Winnipeg. In fact, what it did was persuade them that it was time to change the government. And I think that's what we're talking about here, which is this tone really going to work with the majority of Canadians when it's time for them to vote? Middle of a government's term, when people are cranky about them and worried about their mortgages, yes. On election day, I'm not so sure. And so they need to ask themselves, do we have more than one note in our trumpet here? And is there something that we have to say other than that everything must be bashed?
I think it's really interesting. Made my case for me, David. There's 2 years to the next election. There's lots of optionality. We don't know what a Pierre Poilievre federal election campaign looks like. I don't know whether it looks like the Manitoba PC one or not because we haven't seen it yet. But he has a wide field. What do you think of the media?
What do you think of the media exchanges? I'm not of the view that Poilievre does things accidentally or flies off the handle. I'm of the view that Poilievre does everything strategically, thinks through everything. So he wants these fights. Why does he want them? And what do you think he gets from them?
Because for the reasons Richard Sturzberg set out in the Hub newsletter earlier this week, the news media in Canada has a credibility problem. The market has become polarized and bifurcated, and media outlets, in order to keep their audience, have to line up on one side or the other. And he's acclimatizing voters, in particular his own voters, to the idea that there's half the media that bet their business model on being an attack dog against Pierre Poilievre. And he's getting people used to that. And I think that's a good use of his time right now.
What if I told you, what if I had a factoid at my disposal?
Yes.
And I told you that 40% of conservative voters think the CBC is an honest and trusted news source.
Right. I would say he's plainly got 40% to go. That's what the next 2 years of that is supposed to be. And look, I mean, some guy rocks up to him in an apple orchard, God only knows where, it goes viral around the English-speaking world, and says, "Hey, you, what do you say to people, all the people who say you're just Trump?" The laziest possible reporting.
But that's different. And that's different. And people thought that, I think that played differently, maybe, than these regular, just hostile exchanges with the Parliamentary Press Gallery.
Right. He's now expanding the agenda.
Yeah.
Yes. And he's got 2 years to do it. And where he learned that from was 4 years of Harper majority. Yeah.
Explain that. What do you mean by that?
That Harper was, after he won the majority in 2011, was hide and seek at times with the media, didn't know quite what to do about Terry Milewski attack of the day on the campaign trail, that he hadn't led the groundwork for getting ahead of that line of attack, and Poilievre's not going to let the next 2 years go to waste in that regard. I say that with the greatest respect to Milewski, who's been a good reporter on Air India and lots of other things.
Brian, you're shaking your head. Sounds like you got to say something. And you are the person that told us at the end of the Alberta election campaign that earned media wasn't worth a pinch of shit anymore.
Well, but I think as the public is not following the political news very closely, that's for sure. That doesn't mean it isn't worth anything. Look, I'm sorry to say this. I say this respectfully to my friend Diet. The populist right is on the march all around the world. And Trump has changed that movement, and a lot of what they do is deeply troubling. And one of the things that's deeply troubling about them, as opposed to the kind of conservatives that we're used to in Canada, more or less, Mulroney era conservatives, with whom the country was, I profoundly disagreed with much of what they did, but the country felt reasonably safe in their hands. Is the country safe in the hands of these people? And one of the things that they do is that when there's media that they don't like, they set out to destroy it. And that's what Mr. Poilievre is trying to do with our national broadcaster. He doesn't like them because they ask him questions that he doesn't like. So he wants to use his power to destroy them. And I think that is not acceptable. I don't think it is acceptable for a political party, when it doesn't like how it's being covered, to set out to silence the people who it doesn't like. And
but Brian,
I don't love the CBC. I have many.
Not the media of the 1988 election.
I don't love the CBC. I have many criticisms of the CBC, and much can be done to improve them for sure. But I don't like a lot of the coverage that they've given my party over the years. I watched extremely well-paid CBC host sneer and scoff at Jack Layton, just mock him on an interview, and you went, "What? Why are you doing that?" So I too have many objections to them, but it never crossed my mind, sitting as a national campaign director, that therefore what I'm going to do about it is destroy them. We can criticize them, we can hold them accountable, but to say that they have to be shut down because I don't like them, these are the acts of an authoritarian. And that's one of the things that Mr. Poilievre needs to be held accountable for in a coming election, which is, if this is your instinct toward people that you don't like, who else don't you like that you're going to behave that way to?
Well, we have the freest and most diverse news media operation we've ever had in the country's history today. Herle is part of the ecosystem of that. The CBC is in a different world than it was in 1988. We have a variety of media outlets in the country that have, for their own reasons, as part of the business model. I'm not saying it's a partisan plot here. They're trying to stay in business by lining up behind people's understandings of the political world around them and reinforcing it. And that means there's going to be so much immediate.
Everybody is angry at them. Okay.
Yeah.
They're equal opportunity offensive to everybody in the political system, but only this Conservative Party wants to react to the coverage they don't like by saying we're going to destroy you. And that raises character issues.
Okay. I think go ahead and finish up and then we'll move on. Because
every campaign has a strategy for trying to shape the media coverage that it gets.
All right.
Everyone.
I've kept you guys a long time, but I do want to talk about the NDP if you have a few minutes.
Right.
I find them in a really interesting position. They're worried about losing seats and votes to the Conservatives in certain ridings and certain demographics. They're not doing great in the polls, but it's not a particularly bad time for the NDP in the polls. And in fact, they are tied with the Liberals in English Canada at the current point in time. I see their problem as that this is shaping up to be a change election, and their deal with the Liberals puts them on the side of incumbency. And I don't know how they're going to maneuver their way out of that. And my initial problem in analyzing the future is that I am assuming now, based on what I'm seeing and hearing, that the government may give the NDP a fig leaf of pharmacare in terms of some framework legislation, but they are not going to give the NDP a pharmacare program before the next election. And so I don't know what that means for, especially how the NDP positioned pharmacare coming out of their convention as the sine qua non of the arrangement, how this carries forward. Do you want to start, Brian?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, David. Look, you're right, first of all, that they're doing okay. I mean, they're not in a position to win the next election in the current numbers, but compared to, for example, the way things were in the 90s, in the high noon of the Chrétien government, when the federal NDP was happy when they crested over 6%, being at around 20, 22 and competitive for second place with the Liberals is an okay place to be. Let's start with that. Their problem is Quebec. So when the Liberals and the New Democrats are both at 22 or something like that, what that means is that what's preventing the New Democrats from cleanly breaking through to second place is that they're not competitive yet in Quebec. So if I'm the New Democrat strategist, I go, well, this is better than it's been, but it's certainly not victory yet. So the question is, how are you going to play your cards at this Parliament? Now, look, further to the discussion we just had about our friends on the blue team, Team Orange cannot out-anger the current populist Conservative Party. They've got the market cornered on being angry and shouting and trying to bash things. And then, in any event, that's never been their game. So the federal NDP's high noon in federal politics up to now has always been to play your cards, sometimes very weak cards, but to play your cards of minority parliaments to get things done. And you might remember that the whole core of the 2011 Layton appeal, where they were starting to break through, and in another scenario they might have done very well, was work together to get things done. Work together to get things done is what their voters want. They want them to get in there and use whatever power they've been given in an election to get some stuff done. And the Exhibit A of this is on some lovely postage stamps. It's the former Premier of Saskatchewan, Tommy Douglas, who played a very, very weak hand in Parliament to help make Medicare happen. And even though, as I think we've discussed on this call before, the Prime Minister of the day was actually Lester Pearson, the guy who was on the stamp is Tommy Douglas, because he helped make it, drove it to make it happen. That's what our voters want. Okay, they want you to try.
John Ibbotson says it was Diefenbaker's idea, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Everybody was in on that, and I think the Tories actually voted for the bill, as I remember. So anyway, all this to say, so here we are with this pharmacare thing. Now look, this is my understanding. Okay, I'm not the federal NDP. This is what I understand. That accord was fairly carefully written, and the New Democrats who thought about it expected that about at this point in the proceedings, there would be a whole bunch of Liberals who would be arguing that fiscally we can't do this. Okay, fiscally it's way too expensive. No, we can't do it. So they didn't ask for a $30 billion pharmacare plan as in that accord. What they asked for in that accord was a bill that set up a framework for it, exactly as you just laughingly said. And that's what they want. Okay, that's what they expected the government set up for, and that's what they expect. And they're being patient in negotiating it. Jagmeet Singh just made a statement where he said we can wait a little longer to get this done. But my sense of where they're coming from is if there's no bill, then there will be no deal. And the government therefore has a mechanism to get itself out of its accord with the deal with the Democrats as it wants to. All it needs to do is not do a bill sometime in January or early February and say they're not going to. And then that accord is over. And the Democrats could live with that, David, because what they would then do is they would go into straight opposition. They would take the government on, as you were, I think, suggesting that maybe they should. And then the government's going to have to do a budget deal with the Bloc Québécois. Okay, and we'll see how they do. It's going to be, I think, an expensive shopping list, and it will position the Bloc to be able to argue in the next federal election that they do actually get things done, which is their whole case in Quebec. And that's not going to be helpful to the Liberals in a circumstance in which they have to do very well in Quebec to hope to get reelected. So I don't think it's going to be smart for the Liberals to do that. But let's be clear. The New Democrats, I don't believe, will support the government in the House, irregardless of the political consequences, if they renege on the agreement that they made. Because these are Labour people, and when you break a contract with them, then they don't say, okay. And I think then where are we at? So I think my understanding of where the thoughtful folks in the Liberal government are is they're concerned that if the markets understand that the government has just signed up for a $30 billion plan, that there might be some unhappiness in the markets, and maybe the bond raters will give them a hard time. And it isn't all that salient politically, although I would debate that. And so they've got a choice that they can make. They can say we've agreed to a framework. We have put a couple of drugs into it to show how it works. And if we, the Liberals, are reelected, this is what we're going to do. We will slowly put more stuff into it over time, and we will be cautious and incremental, and we will work within the framework that we have set for ourselves. And the Democrats will campaign in the next election saying, we got the bill, but if you want pharmacare, then you have to send more of us to Parliament, or otherwise the Liberals won't do it. And then they will battle over this in the debate for cross-pressured Liberal and Democrat voters. That's the deal. The Liberals can take it, or they can choose not to take it, in which case the Bloc lies before them and they can buy themselves another year. Good luck.
Jesus, Tim, I could see all those permutations going on in your head as Brian was laying that out.
Well, I mean, I sit there and go, to be honest with you, a framework deal seems like a small price to pay to buy time, to be honest with you. If that is sufficient, it actually doesn't seem like that big a price. And that being said, I do think that, as the Liberal support has dropped, yes, there's a big hole in Quebec, but I think, when you're kind of tied, at some point in there, we all said, oh, the NDP don't want an election. They don't have the money in the bank. They don't have the candidates. They don't have the polling support. But, 22 starts to make that case a bit different. I mean, I'm not sure the election would end up that way. But all that being said, that, somewhere in there, that judgment of whether you care if you're a New Democrat changes. Whereas I think at this point, as we've articulated earlier in this thing, it's pretty clear to us that the government has decided it needs 2 years, right? And then it's planning for 2 years to get to a point where it can then run and hope it's in a position to have an economy and interest rates and inflation that work in its favor. So that suggests it should be willing to pay a price and, frankly, a framework agreement. No matter how ridiculous I think pharmacare is, framework agreement about pharmacare that allows the kind of fight that Brian talked about in the next election is when you go, well, I'd take that every day.
Ian, what do you think?
Well, the NDP is coming off of 2 consecutive kind of rough elections. The 2019 election, the party lost basically half the seats. It didn't do any better in the 2021 election. So it is Brian's counsel here that the party is doing relatively better is about right. I think 20% of the polls, or whatever it is at the moment, is better than they were in the 2021 and 2019 elections. So good on them. Problem is, everything that Poilievre has said about the number one and number two issues in the public mind of affordability and cost of living, or whatever we want to call it, are things that the NDP could well have said. I mean, they're not that, it would have been a different tone. It would have been expressed in different language, but your house costs too much, your rent costs too much, your food costs too much, and we've got to do something about it. And we're going to force the provinces and municipalities to build more houses. And so the NDP could have said that and didn't. I think now the map starts to change, right? Or the map has started to change, and you start to see the Poilievre campaign and NDP, the beginnings of the NDP campaign, get worried about areas where we wouldn't have been worried 15 or 20 years ago. And I remember in 2006 explaining, somebody in the press gallery asked me, we were on the bus, how am I supposed to know how well you're doing? I said, if we're on the 407, if we're north of the 407, it's bad news. If we're on the 407, it's pretty good news. And if the bus travels along the 401, it's great. Because that was the map at the time. We were trying to take seats away, frankly, from you guys. But now we're talking about 403 campaign, the QEW campaign. There's a bunch of different seats at play here, plus the interior.
Niagara Peninsula, Southwest Ontario.
The interior of BC, the northwest corner of BC. We haven't been competitive there since the Conservative Party was created 20 years ago in 2003. It's reshuffling the calculations here. And as a result, I think the models that we've traditionally used to try to attribute campaign resources to where they need to be, all of those are being recalibrated right now. They're being recalibrated inside the Conservative Party, and I know they're being recalibrated inside the NDP because the NDP is very good at this. So we're in a bit of a different battle here. I think the assumptions we've had since the end of the Chrétien era about where politics is competitive and the role of the 905 and so on and so forth, that's out the door. The NDP has had trouble with private sector union members for a while. And Poilievre understands that. Poilievre is sharpening on that front, just as Doug Ford did in the past.
Thomas Frank explained all this decades ago, and what's the matter with Kansas?
Right. Yeah. And this is a long-standing tradition. I'm not sure that pharmacare, Brian's explanation of the strategy of pharmacare, I hope we record that and turn that into a 2-minute NDP infomercial in the next election campaign and see how it goes, because about the minute, great respect to Brian, I had a little bit of trouble following the strategic calculation. Yeah, go have a 2-year fight about pharmacare.
Brian, there does seem to be a different calculation. You portrayed this agreement as in being the long history of the NDP to get out of minorities what can be gotten out of minorities and work together with people. And certainly that is the David Lewis tradition of that. But it's not really how I read Layton. And I think that the Layton era of the NDP understood more, or either understood better or prioritized more the fact that their real problem in politics is not the Conservatives, but the Liberals. And that the real political objective is to kill the Liberal Party. And based on that theory, a bad day for the Liberal Party is by definition a good day for the NDP. So why wouldn't they be interested in precipitating an election at a time when it looks like the Liberal Party might just get its ass completely handed to it?
Well, any opposition party has to play a double game in a minority parliament. Okay, a double game is that you criticize the government. That's your job as an opposition party, and then you maneuver in the House to get some do's done so that you can point to them and do this thing that I was talking about. You need to be really successful. I don't think you can usually play straight negative. You need to have an offer, and then the issue. Look, in Western Canada, it's a different game for the NDP, but in federal politics, the NDP has never won. So how can it point credibly to make us the government if you don't have any achievements to point to?
Right.
This is where you get them. Okay, so that's what they're up to. It's not very complicated. They're loading for a campaign. They're just loading all the bullets that you need, some of which are not just bashing the government. Some of it is pointing to things you would do.
Right.
Now, Layton's self-image was not, I ran a straight negative campaign. And I don't want to.
No, and I'm not implying he ran a straight negative campaign.
No, but let me
negative.
you might recall that we all worked happily together on one budget at the end of the Liberal regime that you guys were such effective senior people for. Where we did a budget together.
Not sure it was
Let me rephrase this, Brian. I feel that Layton was more ambivalent about Martin losing to Harper than Singh is about Trudeau losing to Poilievre.
Well, I look. There's a diversity of views about this. There are. You can hear New Democrats who say, blue red, it's all the same. It doesn't matter. We're just going to play our game, okay? And there was certainly a thread of that in 05 with Mr. Martin, who was not, as you know, not loved by Mr. Layton. Mr. Layton was extremely critical of Mr. Martin for, as you recall, on the homelessness issue, and he took that really personally. But I do think that the rise of the populist right is worrying Social Democrats, and not just in Canada. And that makes it a little bit harder to be cavalier about this. And you have to think seriously about what does it mean to have populist right-wingers running the country. And that was what I was talking about earlier. And so it becomes a little bit less easy to persuade your base that we don't care if it's the Tories or Liberals in office, because of what I was saying earlier about is the country safe in the hands of these Conservatives. And so that makes them a little less inclined to be cavalier about no problem, we'll have an election, and a little more attentive to trying to make the Parliament work, because in any event, they want to make it work. You shouldn't, when you are handed power in a Parliament, you should be a little careful about being in too much of a hurry to hand it back and to insist on another election. The public gets kind of impatient with you if you do that. They go, we gave you some tools. What can you do with them? And that's what they've been trying to do. And let's remember, the current Prime Minister tested this. He had a minority parliament. He wasn't very happy in it. So he did a do-over and got another minority parliament. And then they all decided, okay, well, we have a minority parliament. Let's see if we can make it work. That's where we're at. But what is not available is free. Okay? Like this game of, you don't have anywhere to go. Okay, we got you in the corner. You're going to vote for us whether you like it or not. That doesn't work with Labour people. Okay, they will, at the end of the day, if you try to play that game with them, they'll buck back.
But I do get the sense on a personal level that the Prime Minister is doing an extremely good job of dealing with Jagmeet Singh, right? Their regular communications, he shares information with them. So from to the extent that the political is personal, I think he's managing the relationship in a much better, a more positive way that just on a personal level makes it more difficult to step away. And not impossible. We all know we make decisions in politics that sometimes go against personal relationships, but I do think he's managing the relationship as well as he can to ensure that there's a stickiness there.
Yeah, but the Trudeau strategy of 2015 is still in the background, right? Electoral reform,
of course.
Legalize cannabis, run a deficit. We have to win by taking half the NDP's votes away, and I think that's still the end. There's a short-term game being played here and a long-term game being played.
As there should be.
This is what's interesting about minority parliaments, and frankly, I think on this, it would be nice to think that we're maturing a little bit. So let's look at, for example, the Horgan government, which was a minority government when it first got in. They were governing with the Green Party in a framework similar to this. And by the way, that was on the Democrats' minds when they did this one. Premier Horgan and the leader of the Green Party worked collaboratively. Okay, they had weekly meetings. They were civil to each other. They had a no surprises model, and they got a bunch of things done. And then somewhere along the line, everybody knows that in a parliament, at some point the accord will end, and then you're going to compete. But if you want to make it work and get some things done, then there needs to be a level of civility. And I think, Tim, you're absolutely right that
But it's not a very good example for the junior partner in the coalition, because Horgan proceeded to destroy that party.
Yeah. And that's your risk. That is a huge risk, that when you play this game, you're rewarded by the public by being clobbered. And that has been the federal record, which is that the federal NDP gets rewarded for all its good deeds by being clobbered. And you know what? At a certain point, you go, that's the way it goes. But it's better than nothing, okay? Because in the long game, at least you have these achievements to point to and you can rebuild, as opposed to
I'll give you
a fourth party. And we issued some
$100.
beautiful press releases and we read them. Okay,
I'll give you $100 if at the end of the election campaign, most Canadians think that dental care was delivered to them by the NDP.
I mean, there's salience issues here. Okay.
Yeah, there really are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's salience issues here. That's why I cling to the point that the public still cares a lot about healthcare. They really do. Okay. See it in all the polls.
We agreed there'd be no photographers, so there's no photo of the occasion, but I remember in my mind's eye the day that the great strategist Jack Layton and his team of extraordinarily perspicacious advisors walked into room 409S of the Center Block on the first weekend of November of 2005, and that was the end of the Martin government. It happens, and it came after a summer of we'd put a lot of pressure on the NDP, and I think Mr. Layton heard it and made a very careful assessment of what is best course of action for the party was, and he was right. The question is Jagmeet Singh the same kind of strategist?
That isn't what happened, but I remember the moment.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody's got a Zaccardelli in their pocket this time.
Yeah.
All the arrived public servants at committee are doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. You guys, this was fantastic. Conversations like this about politics don't happen anywhere else. I'm so thrilled to be able to assemble the three of you and for your generous sort of commentary. It's really great. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, David.
Good, David.
All right. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail. And I really want to thank all of you Herle Burly-ites who watched and listened. Take care of yourselves this week, and there will be more of us next week. See you then.